Somebody's history is really, really important, and you can't escape your history. You're not going to keep getting away with this because they are serial and repeat offenders. What if they do it in one relationship, they absolutely will do it in the next relationship.
You'd show no remorse or apologise for her death?
Killer narcissists.
He was the last person to see her after they had an argument at their family home.
We had a bit of an argument in regards to the store figures.
He kept tripping up because he thought he was invincible.
Expert abusers.
Very deliberate manipulation to make her think that she's nuts.
The same strategies.
He used to call her princess.
The same traits.
A grandiosity, an entitlement, a lack of empathy.
And it's never their fault.
Mental illness called her death, not me.
As incidents rise,
more women are being murdered by their partners than ever before.
Yeah, you disposed of her in an undignified way.
And sentences don't.
Women as victims have such low status, even when they lose their lives.
They are dangerous and they will remain dangerous.
We investigate why,
dumping her over a ledge to leave her lying in mud,
these criminals continue.
Boris, did you kill Karen?
To be underestimated.
I've got nothing to say to you.
Introducing Kiss and Kill. Episode 8. Breakdown. I'm Alison Sandy.
Rio Marsh was meant to begin his murder trial today, but instead officially started his life sentence as a convicted killer after earlier this month pleading guilty to the fatal domestic violence attack on his ex-partner Mary Mama Benedito.
Jealous and controlling, the man who murdered young mother Dana Isaac sentenced to 44 years behind bars.
A 39-year-old man had been struck by a car. Police identified him as a nearby resident. Inside the home, his partner, Kate Patterson, and their 1-year-old daughter, April, were dead.
Fighting for her life and her unborn child, a 36-year-old pregnant woman run over by a car, police say on purpose.
Kelly Wilkinson was strong, fierce, a loving mother of 3. To her evil, estranged husband, she was a possession he sought to control. Brian Johnston was convicted of stabbing, then setting her on fire in her Arundel home in 2021.
Lily James. At 21, she had already packed so much into her life, but could have achieved so much more.
Lily had her life cut way too short, and not a day goes by that we don't think of her or wonder what we could have done to prevent this from happening.
This is just a snippet of ongoing tragedies filling our news bulletins every night. We know that anyone keeping track of what's being reported recognises just how prolific DV-related killings are. But actually gauging the true extent is more difficult than you'd expect. These tragic and preventable deaths result in lifelong torment and anguish for their families, particularly when dealing with the legal system. So, what can we do about it?
Look, I have learnt a lot since I started this job, which I think I'm a bit surprised about how much more I have learnt. I have, as I said, spent most of my career in this sector.
This is Micaela Cronin, Australia's first domestic family and sexual violence commissioner. She is one of just 3 others in the world, Nicole Jacobs in the UK and Samantha Pache Gassan in Malta. Her appointment came after the 2021 March for Justice protests, where tens of thousands of women across the nation took to the streets calling for an end to gendered violence.
Here in Sydney, crowds demanding change with a simple message: enough is enough.
I think I did understand a lot of what is going on in the community. I have experienced working in family violence, sexual violence services. But I think what has been a surprise to me and is what's happening across the whole country, and the diversity of issues that different communities are facing. And one of the privileges of this role has been having conversations with different communities, really being welcomed into Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander remote communities, migrant and multicultural communities, talking to people from the LGBTQI+ community about what their experiences are, and understanding how differently it impacts on different people, and the need to understand and work with them about what solutions will work for those communities.
This week, we're not focusing on one killer narcissist or expert abuser, but all of them, and why there's a seeming lack of urgency to do something that will really drive these deaths down. So you probably saw this too. The World Health Organization recently released statistics.
I remember when I was working in a women's refuge, and at that time the statistics were 1 in 4. I remember sitting on a tram when I was in my 20s, and counting people and looking at people in the crowd and thinking, so 1 in 4 of you have experienced or are experiencing violence at the moment when you go home. Or in your workplace. And we don't often confront that and think about what it means in our families, in our workplaces. It means that every time we're talking to a large group of people, there will be people in that room who have experienced domestic violence or sexual violence. So we have to be thinking about how we are caring for, responding to, providing services all the time.
Only in the past decade have we learnt about coercive control and gaslighting and all these things that every woman I know understands and has experienced. Is this why we're where we are, do you think? I mean, why are we where we are, where it's actually increasing? Intimate partner homicides anyway are increasing.
One of the really critical things that we are still grappling with is how do we make our community, our workplaces, our families, our sports clubs, wherever people gather, how do we make them safe for someone to tell somebody what's happening to them? And we know that from the prevalence studies that people still don't go to the police to report sexual violence. Only 1 out of 10 people is what's the research indicates report their experiences of sexual violence. So we don't necessarily know how high the levels of violence are. Domestic violence is no longer just a bloke punching his partner, wife after dinner. We recognise that it's more than just physical violence. We recognise that it's a pattern of controlling behaviour over a long period of time, often, that can be incredibly damaging and abusive. And also gaslighting in relationships are really serious, have really serious impacts on young people. We've got a lot more work to do in terms of understanding the impact on young people. Your question about why are we here now, how have we got to the point where for many people in the community it feels like things are getting worse, I think there's a couple of reasons for that. One is we are talking about it more, so we're more aware of it than we have been in the past. So because over the last few decades we have seen a decline over time in the number of homicides. We've seen an increase in the last few years, and that's deeply worrying because we need to understand if that's one of the things when you talk to researchers is they say this kind of data you need to look at what the trends are over long periods of time to really determine is it going down or is it going up.
You're not including the peripheral victims, like the Bombara case, for example, where it wasn't the intimate partners, but it was related directly. They're not counted as as that, like that's not included. And then also, obviously, the one recently where triple murder in central New South Wales. Those aspects haven't been counted, yet we're confronted with them weekly.
Look, I think that's a really important point, Alison, because what we hear and talk about is the horrific individual incidents of intimate partner homicides. But as you say, there are people in those people's lives, that are often actually also impacted by the violence, but also the destruction that happens to children who are left behind, colleagues who are devastated, friends who've lost families, members, friends who lose people that are central to their lives. So both the other people who are impacted by the violence, but also the chaos it leaves around them. The other is suicide. There is an inquiry at the moment looking into the link between suicide and domestic, family and sexual violence, because we also know that there are very large numbers of women who die as a result of suicide as a direct result of the impact of the domestic, family and sexual violence.
That's not to be confused with the hidden homicides, right? The ones that are written off as suicide and not investigated properly at the time, even and having not been looked through the domestic violence lens.
That's right, and the incredibly high rates of particularly Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women who go missing. There are women who go missing across this country who it is very likely have been murdered, that we just never hear about and are not investigated, and it's not followed up. So there are many more women, children, young people dying as a result of domestic, family and sexual violence than we are aware of or necessarily counting. And there are also many more people in the community who don't necessarily lose their lives, but the rest of their lives are impacted on by domestic, family and sexual violence in other ways.
Commissioner, I don't know if you would have to be aware of Sherele Moody's work. Now, as far as we can tell, I mean, is she the only one actually calculating the femicide stats?
There are a number of groups and people who are counting femicide, and Sherele Moody does an incredible job of keeping, honouring the women, children, young people who've lost their lives to violence. She counts broader than just the women and children and young people who've lost their lives to domestic, family and sexual violence. Counting dead women also keep track of, and government tasked the Australian Institute of Criminology to start making sure that we have an accurate record of women who lose their lives to intimate partner violence. So that's a narrower count. It's a very rigorous count on the basis of when police have really ensured that that they have verified that it is a woman who has died from intimate partner violence. So it is an important thing for us to be keeping a record of and keeping an eye on. But so Sherele Moody's count is the broadest.
Why doesn't government count femicides?
Data is critical. Understanding and having the data that is transparent, that's verifiable, that we can then plan on the basis of, that we can ensure we've got a really good understanding of what the demand for services are so we can invest in that. Understanding and having that data is really important. The benefit of having someone like Sherele Moody doing the work that she does is, as you say, she's built relationships. She can go out fast. She can report on things that she can then ensure are verified afterwards. I think she does that really well. The Australian Institute of Criminology has to be incredibly rigorous about what they can verify before they stick it up on their websites. It's a different burden of proof, and they are working really hard to expand that, because the people at the Australian Institute of Criminology know that we need that data, and they're working really hard to build the databases that will give us a much clearer picture.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just thinking that they should they should get a data unit for your organisation. It would be so much easier.
It's a really good point, Alison, and it's one of the things that in our yearly report to Parliament last year we talked about the importance of data and making sure we've got the baseline and really know a whole lot of those data points that you're talking about. The government has funded the Australian National Research Organisation for Women's Safety, ANROS, and they are convening a group of all of the data custodians, all of the people who are responsible within government to collect data, and we're all working together to make sure we build that picture.
Just to punctuate the point here, which will become even more relevant when you hear the next interview, the Australian Institute of Criminology only records data for part of the issue, intimate partner homicides, and that doesn't include the other people they kill in the process, like children, friends, and other family members. How can they fix the problem if they don't know the extent? And why is there such a reluctance to commit to that? So I asked the Commissioner why domestic violence hardly rated a mention at the last federal election.
Look, it's one of the issues, I agree, we didn't hear anywhere near enough about domestic, family and sexual violence. One of the issues in an election campaign is that politicians want to talk about what their point of difference is. And one of the issues we've got, one of the values we've got, is we've got cross-party support for efforts to respond to domestic, family and sexual violence. I think what is really important across this year is that we do see the tension and the political discussion about what is going to work. And we need the good robust data, the way you've identified and we've been talking about. We need leadership and accountability to be delivering on what is in that plan. And we need investment to respond to the level of demand that everyone in the community is aware of.
I guess when you compare it to other issues, national issues that have been recognised across all elements of government, one of the most notable and one that I worked on was alcohol-fueled violence and the coward punches rather than the king hits, you know, just even renaming that and all the measures that were brought in to counter that. And that worked. But I just feel looking, you know, being in the media now 30 years and looking at the way issues are addressed, it still seems to not have the level of priority as other issues.
You've described what's happened with very appropriately the response to one-hit punches, and that they have been effective, and recognising that as a community we can change this. It is possible to reduce the prevalence of domestic, family and sexual violence. It is possible to end it. And when I say end, one of the things we've been talking about is to make it rare, brief and non-recurrent. And that's what we've seen in other areas where we've tackled it collectively as a community and as government. I do think we have very high levels of government commitment to address this. One of the challenges we've got is that it's a cross-portfolio issue that is very complex, and bringing all of the different portfolios together, getting education and health and justice and policing, as well as social services, all seeing this as their problem, their business, something they need to prioritise and to be joining up their efforts together. We've also got every state and territory has dozens of plans, and we've got a Commonwealth plan that all of the jurisdictions have signed up to. One of the things that we have an opportunity this year is to get alignment, and to get real alignment around a short list of agreed priorities. National Cabinet last year made domestic, family and sexual violence one of their top 6 priorities. We really need to see that implemented this year.
So despite a woman being killed every 4 days, this national crisis isn't even listed in the federal government's top 5 priorities?
I agree there needs to be an ongoing spotlight on, and everybody needs to take it very seriously. How are we going to collectively deal with the challenge we have of domestic, family and sexual violence? I would say that we are definitely not where, when I started working in this sector 35 years ago, we're not where we were, but we are definitely not where we need to be. One of the things that we really need to tackle is cultural change. The attitudes of people in the community who, the ones that are making the bail decisions, making those decisions that it's okay to let somebody out when they've had 6 AVOs against them by 5 women. Why are we not taking that more seriously? Why are we not seeing what the level of risk is? Those homicides in New South Wales were absolutely preventable if we'd recognised the level of risk. So it's attitudes we need to change as much as it is investment, as much as it is about legislative change.
Yeah, but it's also, I guess, about ending the victim blaming too, which obviously is part of the criminal justice process.
Yes, absolutely. We need to recognise and call out, and it's why the introduction and the work around coercive control is so important. Recognising that someone who's experienced years of controlling behaviour won't necessarily present as the ideal victim. They won't look like what you would expect them to. They won't talk about what's happened to them. They won't even necessarily understand themselves that what's been happening to them is actually criminal.
It's also the subliminal or the indirect. Like, for example, for a long time, what was being used to, I guess, illustrate this was warning women not to, walk in dark alleys or wear provocative clothes, or, you know what I mean? Like, them not to take the risk, as opposed to not like to target the actual men that are doing it and tell them not to rape women, like that's still, or not to beat them up, or not to, not to kill them. So, I mean, there seems to be still so much onus on the women, and not enough on the perpetrators, because there's all these mitigating and aggravating circumstances that come up in court to excuse it.
I think that's actually one of the biggest shifts we've seen is, and it's still a long way to go, but recognising that the conversation needs to be about ending men's violence, not just about keeping women and children safe. We absolutely need to keep that focus on responding and keeping people safe and having supports to respond to what their needs are. But having a conversation about understanding what drives, not all men are violent, and what are the pathways into men who are violent. How do we then also help men when they are struggling and they recognise that they want to stop using violence or abusive behaviour in their relationships? Helping understand what is it that means that some young men, some men are being very violent, do think it's okay, some of their what is completely unacceptable and illegal behaviour. How do we better understand that? How do we support those men, young men, from a very young age actually? How are we having the conversations that help shape the way everybody in our community is able to be safe, to have healthy relationships? What does a healthy relationship look like?
The problem I'm dealing with my subject matter is the case studies I am looking at are the ones that, have narcissistic behaviours. Most of them, by the sounds of it, basically have narcissistic personality disorder. So, which when I speak to the experts is really hard to turn around.
I hear what you're saying. There are some instances in which we need to collectively recognise there are serious red flags, and what on earth would we be thinking if we weren't just taking what women in those people's lives are saying seriously, and that we are looking at accountability mechanisms like incarceration. I'm talking about the spectrum of behaviours that when we're talking about, 1 in 3 experiencing, many of the women that I've spoken to also say, look, he's the father of my kids, he's going to be in their lives forever. I just want him to be a good dad to them. I want, I want him to take responsibility. I can't live with him anymore, but I want him to be able to be in those people's lives. Or we also know what happens is he'll go on and find another partner. So we have a responsibility to be looking at the spectrum and to have a range of responses to the different levels of risk and abuse that we're talking about.
I guess the other thing is, and I've been trying to find someone because the New South Wales AG mentioned this the other day. Do we have, or are you aware of anyone who has been a perpetrator of intimate partner homicide who has gone on to become a model citizen?
I can't think of any examples of where there's been a homicide involved, but I do know there are some very good programs where men are involved in leading the programs who have themselves acknowledged that they were perpetrators of domestic family violence, and that they are holding other men accountable, and that they are actually in a really good position to be very honest about having turned their own behaviour around.
And that's the key, isn't it? Is kind of understanding yourself and seeing fault in your own behaviour.
But if they don't take responsibility for their actions, they're not going to change. The accountability that the community imposes on them is different than them personally saying, I was responsible, it's not okay, I recognise the harm that I've done. That is critical to real change.
What are the key takeaways you've discovered?
We've got dozens of plans nationally, recognising there is a phenomenal amount of effort going on, but getting consistent change is actually really difficult and requires significant leadership to do that. That's one of my takeaways, that we really need that united leadership and joined up approach across the whole country. We're a federation, and that makes changing anything really tricky in this country, and things can take a long time. One of the things I have really learnt is the incredible importance of centering people whose lived experience means that they understand the detail of the problem in ways that policymakers never can if they're not listening to them. So the importance of, like what you do, the work of listening and interviewing and talking to people who've directly been impacted by domestic, family and sexual violence, they will understand what the problem is in a way that people who don't have those experiences.
It's funny you should say that, because whenever I talk to people, you can almost, you realise straight away the ones that get it and the ones who don't. And certainly with the hidden homicides work, I've come across plenty who don't.
Yeah, look, we've got a real problem in this country in some pockets of what's called misidentification of who is the primary victim, who is the one who's really most in need of care and support. So sometimes what happens is the police turn up and what they see is a woman screaming and shouting and looking like she's out of control, the man being very calm and speaking to the police as though he's the one who's is the victim of what's going on. And in fact, sometimes women then can actually attack the person who's been violent towards them, because if you think about it, what's happened is the police turning up creates an opportunity for them to express safely how they're feeling. They weren't safe until the police got there, but it can look like they are the perpetrators. That happens far too often in our community, that police do not necessarily identify who is the person who's most in need of protection. It can absolutely look like the person who is the calmest and the most reasonable in the way that they are communicating, that they are not the one who is perpetrating harm, which is why coercive control legislation is so important, because it allows them to make decisions based on a pattern of behaviour over a long period of time.
Now, I'm going to finish on what you mentioned about the significant leadership, because I think what most of us particularly were quite surprised with was the last federal election. And everyone I know just about is voting for the lesser of two evils every time, because it's just, there's nothing really that seems to quite separate.
I don't think it's naive at all. I think it's critically important that we, and what does give me hope, Alison, is that I do think we've got that leadership. I do think Minister Plibersek is passionate, knowledgeable. She was part of developing the first National Action Plan. This is the second one. She's frustrated about the lack of change, and she really deeply wants to drive change. So I feel that gives me hope, and I think that we need to see it across the board.
Thanks for joining us. One woman is killed in Australia every week, at least. Why is that?
Australian Social Services Minister Tanya Plibersek speaks to 7 News political reporter Isabel Mullen.
Well, rates of family and domestic violence are too high in this country, and we are absolutely determined as a government to change that. Family, domestic and sexual violence are unacceptable, and we have to work together. Of course, the government has a role, state and territory governments have a role, but every Australian can play a role in this too. We need to change those rates of violence. We need to change the public acceptance of the sort of violence-supporting rhetoric that we hear.
We have here that in its latest report, the World Health Organisation said violence against women is the oldest problem, as you've said, but one that has had the least action to combat it. It states 1/3 of women globally will experience domestic or sexual violence, 1/3 of women rather, when it used to be 1 in 4. Do you think your government is acting with urgency to address that alarming rate?
We absolutely are. No government in Australian history has done more or shown a greater commitment to ending family, domestic and sexual violence than our government. We've invested over $4 billion in measures like supporting victims of violence, like changing perpetrators' behaviour, supporting children with child-specific counselling. We're also investing in things like more housing for victims of family and domestic violence, over $1.2 billion for crisis and transitional housing for women and children escaping domestic violence.
Why do you think the rate of domestic violence is getting worse?
Well, in Australia we actually see some positive signs when it comes to rates of family and domestic violence, but we see some areas where there is still real concern about numbers getting worse. There's not one story to tell. If we look at sexual assault, the numbers are getting much worse, and in particular the assaults against girls under the age of 18 are getting much worse. So if we have a statistic in an area like that that's getting much worse, we need to redouble our efforts in that area. It's one of the reasons that we're working with young people to ask them not to be on social media as young as they are, not to be looking at pornography when they're under the age of 16 and getting their sex education from violent and degrading images online. We see that 3/4 of men want to do better when it comes to family and domestic violence. We've seen good improvement in attitude amongst men wanting to reduce rates of violence.
Why hasn't a single publicly accessible national database for domestic violence offenders been established?
Well, we're investing about $83 million in better tracking and tracing dangerous offenders. We know that offenders move across state and territory borders, and we know that someone who's offended in family and domestic violence may also turn up in police databases as a perpetrator of sexual assault or child sexual assault.
But is that a single publicly accessible database?
Well, the problem with the idea of one single database is that only a fraction of violent assaults are reported to police. If we are relying on one database to keep people safe, we miss most of the offenders. We would miss most of the offenders.
But do you have to just rely on one? Why not have it and then do what you're already doing as well?
What we're investing in as a Commonwealth government is making sure that we know when people move across state borders who they are, where they are, what they've done, what they're at risk of doing, and that systems talk to each other.
But that's not a national database.
Well, it's it's systems talking to each other across state and territory borders.
Is the difference here that you don't want that information to be publicly accessible?
No, I don't have any problem with offenders, violent offenders, having their identities made public. I think if you do the crime, then it's people's right to know that you're dangerous and people should stay away from you. I don't have any problem with offenders' identities being made public. What I'm saying to you is that if people are relying on a list of people who've done the wrong thing, then we're missing most of the people who've done the wrong thing. Only a very small fraction of sexual assaults are reported to police. Only a very small fraction of domestic violence offences are reported to police. You could very easily give someone a dangerous sense of security if they look up a list and some guy's name's not on the list and they think this guy's safe. You know, my daughter's dating this guy, he must be okay, he's not on the list. I think that's a real problem.
This was raised as an issue after Clare's law was introduced in the UK, where members of the public can ring police to find out if someone has a history of domestic violence. Here, UK criminologist Jane Monckton-Smith reflects on its pluses and minuses.
There are problems. I think we've had a lot of problems with Clare's law. The police don't always use it. They don't proactively very often go out and tell victims. They don't always tell victims even when they ask. It's got to be based on each case. And it's only the victim who can be told and nobody else, because we have, you know, families desperately worried about what's happening to their loved one. They can put in a request, but the results of that request will be given only to the victim. So there's some quite complex things going on. And also, just because you're told about somebody's history, I was reviewing a homicide for a government process, and during that, the police had gone to the victim before she died and said, look, this person has this history. Now, when she heard what his history was, she was even more scared of him. So just telling somebody comes with some kind of responsibility, I think, to say, okay, now we've told you, can we help you navigate this now that we've told you? Because you can imagine how frightening that is. You're thinking about leaving somebody and then you find out what they'd done to previous partners.
Yeah. Man.
It's not necessarily completely empowering. It can be, but it can also be terrifying.
Of course, it's not marketed to be the ultimate fail-safe, just one of the nets cast to warn women.
It can save lives, yes. I've known people get a Clare's Law and leave successfully. And it sends out a very strong message. One, that somebody's history is really important. And two, you can't escape your history. You're not going to keep getting away with this because they are serial and repeat offenders. If they do it in one relationship, they absolutely will do it in the next relationship.
It's likely that had a publicly accessible national database for domestic violence offenders existed here, that Alicia Little may not have lost her life.
Why doesn't the government officially count and publicise femicide victims, and why is it left to Sherele Moody to do?
Well, we do count femicide victims. The Australian Institute of Criminology reports every year on the number of homicides in Australia, and it's been doing that since 1990. Intimate partner homicide is specified in that count.
As mentioned by the Commissioner before, the numbers counted aren't a proper representation of female homicides, which Minister Plibersek acknowledges.
The Australian Institute of Criminology, though, can't tell the whole story of the number of women who are killed every year because of family and domestic violence, in part because they're waiting for the courts or the police to determine that a death is murder or suicide. Their numbers have to reflect that. But also because we don't have a way yet of counting the women who take their own lives because of family or domestic violence or because of sexual assault. I've actually asked for a parliamentary inquiry to be undertaken. It's underway at the moment, so that we can get a better idea of the lives truly that are lost to family, domestic and sexual violence by working out how we can begin to take account of the suicides that happen because of these crimes as well.
It also seems unreasonable that those killed as part of the intimate partner homicide aren't included in the statistics.
Will we see a Royal Commission into domestic violence?
Well, I think the frontline workers who work in this area are very clear about the fact that we've had 8 major inquiries in just the last few years with over 1,000 recommendations that consistently say very similar things about what we need to do as a country. We want to just get on and do those things. We've got almost 600 actions underway right now as a nation, programs that we're investing in, new approaches that we're taking. 122 of them are led by the Commonwealth Government. We don't need another inquiry to tell us what we need to do.
Are you confident that implementing those recommendations will significantly reduce the death toll?
Yes, I am, but we need to stick with it. I mean, this is a problem that has been with us for thousands of years. We need, as a whole society, to tackle the attitudes that allow family and domestic and sexual violence to happen. Government has a big role to play. We are prepared to play it. We're prepared to invest, but it takes ordinary Australians to say enough is enough.
Tens of thousands of Australians have come together over the weekend, rallying to end violence against women. So far this year, 32 women have been killed in Australia, with 27 of those allegedly at the hands of a current or former partner. Prime Minister Anthony Albanese has declared the situation as a national crisis and has called an emergency national cabinet to solely focus on domestic and family violence for this weekend.
Which we are.
What work is being done by the federal government to understand intimate partner homicides and ensure that any figures on that include its other victims like family members and or friends of the victims?
Well, the parliamentary inquiry that we've launched into suicide that relates to family, domestic and sexual violence is an opportunity for every Australian who's got a concern in this area to make a submission to that inquiry, to speak to the members of Parliament who are leading that inquiry. This inquiry is an opportunity to really get into the detail of those numbers and how we can have a better understanding of the huge impact this is having on our community.
Domestic Family and Sexual Violence Commissioner Micaela Cronin says the issue needs real leadership in the government to be addressed properly. Do you consider yourself to be that leader?
Well, I take this role very seriously indeed. I was the women's officer dealing with sexual harassment on campus when I was at university. My first job when I finished university was in the domestic violence unit of the New South Wales Government Ministry for Women at the time. I have spent my life working on this issue. I will not rest until we see a turnaround in these figures. We've lost too many women and too many children to family and domestic violence, and I am convinced that we can do better as a nation. I am convinced that we can do better.
Throughout this series, we've reflected on some of the monumental law reforms in Australia over the years. Most significantly, in the 1970s, starting with the introduction of no-fault divorce in 1975.
One or other of them will be able to apply to the court for an application for divorce.
It came into effect the following year. In 1977, South Australia became the first state to outlaw rape in marriage. The rest of the states followed suit over the next decade, the last being Queensland in 1989. But it wasn't until 1994 that it became nationwide, with the Northern Territory finally succumbing. In 2012, the Workplace Gender Equity Act was passed, and in this decade, we've seen the start of the rollout of coercive control laws. Australian Femicide Watch founder Sherele Moody says it's not nearly enough, calling on the nation's leaders to step out of their comfort zone.
I think that that our politicians are in a bubble and they're getting the same kind of feedback from the same kind of people. They're not actually getting the feedback from people outside of that circle of influence. I mean, if you're listening to the same people telling you the same thing over and over again, then you're just going to go with it. I think that the best thing that she could do is actually come and sit down with the families that I work with and have real conversations with them. And also come out to the regions.
Sherele disagrees that a Royal Commission is redundant.
Even if they say to us, well, it's going to cost hundreds of millions of dollars to have an in-depth Royal Commission. We had an in-depth Royal Commission for the Defence Force suicides, right? That was very in-depth and it was over a long amount of time. But it was done because there was concern about the mental health of men in that sector. So, and it's a much smaller group than women collectively, but they were willing to invest in that, right? If you invest in a Royal Commission into femicide in Australia, you actually invest in our future, because the impact of domestic violence alone costs our country more than $20 billion a year. Like, that research was done quite a few years ago, about 2017. So even if it does cost $500 million for a Royal Commission, we have the opportunity to reduce that $20+ billion a year impact of domestic violence itself down if we find the right solutions. And that's not even taking into account the other forms of violence, so the associate violence and the stranger violence. So yeah, like in the long run, it's a small investment for a much bigger payoff. Violence against women is not inevitable, it is super preventable. This is not a cancer that you can't cure. You can cure it. And we need to put the money into looking at what the symptoms are, what the treatments are, and how can we start making this end.
Maybe they're afraid of is if they do the Royal Commission and find out the issues and they have to actually do something about it.
If there is a Royal Commission, they'll find out that this problem is much worse than the government is willing to admit, that it is much worse. And they will, it will be very hard to turn away from the stories that women come and tell, or that families come and tell about their person. If you start putting a human face on this day in, day out, like every day, all the time, you start to change the perception in the community about how she's ended up dead. It changes the way that people victim blame, the way that they, erase the behaviour of perpetrators. I think that there's a big payoff here, and the payoff is saving lives. And I would say that saving lives is worth $500 million. It is absolutely worth it. So one of the biggest things that people who oppose the idea of a Royal Commission into femicide, or the killing of women and girls, as I call it, say that we already know what the failures are. Yes, we already know what some of the failures are, but we actually don't know all of the failures. By saying that we don't need a wholesale examination of violence against women and girls, or the killing of women and girls, is just short-sighted. Women and girls are dying at higher rates than they have done for a long time. You know, that the toll is going up year on year. Violence against women and girls is not changing. It's still, that same level of statistics. And we make up more than half the population. The one thing that almost every woman will experience in their lifetime is an act of violence in some form. There may be harassment on the street, it might be domestic and family violence, coercive control, physical violence, rape. There's a raft of things, stalking, all the things. That's one of the clear things that we will all experience. Why can't we have a national examination of this?
Now, one of the things, Sherele, I spoke to Micaela Cronin recently, and we both discussed the fact that there is no official, other than yourself doing it off your own bat. But really, you know, it's just you, isn't it?
Yeah, it is just me. The thing is that I guess as a standalone person who does this documenting without the controls of policymakers and politicians and academics, I can bring you the deaths that others won't or don't for a myriad of reasons.
So what are they missing, Sherele?
In order to do a count properly, you have to look at every death on its merits. You have to speak to family. You have to speak to police. You have to examine the circumstances around her death and make a call on it. And often it's even just having that conversation with police will guide what decision you make around this death. But you need police on the page with you. You need them to say, yes, this is what it is, but we can't get it across the line legally. We can't prove an intent to murder, so we've had to go with this charge because that's what we can prove. So, and then we have the deaths that are misidentified. So those are the deaths, for instance, where a woman dies and her death is ruled as suicide, misadventure, or accident. And often due to a lack of investigation and a lack of speaking to family to take into context around, violence that she was experiencing, whether it was domestic violence or violence at the hands of someone that she's not related to. And I've said this before to you, Western Australia is really bad at this. They haven't actually changed a lot since Amy Wensley's death. But for instance, we have around 4 black women dying in suspicious circumstances in WA last year. Each of those deaths, the families have come to me and said, she was murdered. This is what I know about it. In one circumstance, the woman had severe facial bruising. It was very clear to her mum that she had been beaten to a pulp, and the police refused to treat it as a homicide.
I then asked Sherele her thoughts on the National Action Plan for Domestic Violence.
I think that they're definitely tinkering at the edges. They're making the right noise when a right noise needs to be made, but it is very piecemeal. There's been no holistic approach. Now, I know that there is that national plan, and the first part of that national plan was released. The very same person who told me that the federal government's intimate partner violence toll ticker, whatever they want to call it, is being useless. They said to me that the first part of that plan was really just about putting everybody's ideas on the page and making sure that they all felt represented, that it really was just a ticking the box approach, and that very little of that has been implemented. That I was told that the next stage of that plan is under construction, and there's a hope that some very real transformational policy ideas will be put into it, and that the funding will be made available and acted upon. We don't treat violence against women with the same urgency as we treat other forms of violence.
Well, you've been beating your head against a brick wall for a long time.
Yeah. Yeah, it's been a while. The Victorian government's never had a conversation with me about it. I've never been approached by the family, whoever is in that role, in the family violence role, in the women's ministerial role. Just never had those conversations. So it's interesting. Yeah, I mean, that wall is a big conversation starter, and I've stood down there and watched people have conversations around the killing of women, and how it just, you look at those faces and you can see that it cuts across every demographic, and they're really interesting conversations to listen to. Not all those conversations are ones that I'm comfortable with, but a lot of them are incredible. So I don't know. It's funny how everyone ignores it except the people walking past.
So, as well as the She Matters murals and being the only one in Australia comprehensively counting femicide victims, Sherele has also set up a refuge in Melbourne for domestic violence victims.
So this is a one-bedroom apartment in Melbourne. I've called it Stacey's Sanctuary.
At her own expense.
So I have bought this property. I've paid for it with my own money, paid for it in full. And yeah, it's my contribution to helping solve, in a very small way, one of the biggest barriers to women finding housing and safety. So for example, here in Victoria, we have exceptionally long transitional housing waiting lists. And it is not unusual for women escaping violence to be stuck on that waiting list for 8 or more years. Stacey's Sanctuary is a particularly important project for me, and there's 2 reasons. Family violence was very prevalent in my childhood, and it was something that my grandmother herself endured, and I saw her being beaten. Now, my grandmother is Indigenous, and she was a very proud woman and a very strong woman, but she was unable to get housing when she needed it. My stepfather killed 2 little girls, Stacey Ann Tracy and Sandra Bacon. This sanctuary is named after Stacey Ann. So I have known her family since the day of her funeral, and they embraced me as a friend, and I consider them some of the most important people in my life. I can't change Stacey Ann's story. I cannot change Sandra's story. In fact, I cannot change any of the stories of the women and children that I document. But what their stories can do is change the future for other women and other girls. And, you know, if that is the only thing that comes out of it, then I've done my job.
While it's been hard going, Sherele says there has been progress.
You know, like, I can be quite negative in this space because basically what I do is very disheartening, and it's really hard to kind of shake off that negativity. One small thing that I've noticed when I started selling the t-shirts, for example, to fund my work, 100% of the buyers were women, and I've actually noticed an uptick in the last 6 or so months of men buying the product, and they're not buying it for their partners. They're messaging me and saying, hey, I got that Stop Killing Women t-shirt because we need to change. Like, it's an example of men recognizing this as a problem and coming forward and doing something about it. I know it's a really weird thing a kind of example to give you, but around 10% of the product is now being bought by men, which is really amazing to me because I never thought that I would see that. I know it's a crazy example, but I mean, it's something that I can monitor because I, keep data on the sales. So I'm able to go in and kind of track that data and be able to go, oh, look, actually, the message is impacting at the grassroots level and they are voting with their wallets. They're actually saying this is something that I want to do because I believe it can contribute to ending violence. So yeah, it's a stupid example, but I think it's when I see that, I'm always very happy.
It's a fantastic example.
Yeah, I think that's really good.
One of the most important parts of our justice system is the coroner's court. Its primary role is the investigation of unnatural, violent or suspicious deaths, as well as those which occur in care or custody. It takes a special person to be a coroner, or at least a good coroner.
I was very happy there, despite the very sad and sometimes tragic subject matter.
I've been fortunate enough to get to know many in my time. They include Western Australia's former Deputy State Coroner, Evelyn Vicker, the former Queensland and New South Wales State Coroner, Michael Barnes, and this man.
I really enjoyed working with the people I was working with, and the possibility every now and again of helping some people get through the worst times of their lives.
Now an adjunct law professor at the University of New South Wales, Hugh Dillon was a magistrate from 1996 to 2017 and New South Wales Deputy State Coroner from 2008 to 2016. You'll notice there's an overlap there. We'll touch on that later. Most recently, Professor Dillon did a PhD on his former workplace, which could be gruelling, to say the least.
Everything you did had real meaning. I'd come from the local court where, to be perfectly honest, a lot of the subject matter I just found grueling, hideous, vicious, nasty, but I also felt a lot of it, the outcomes actually didn't change anything much. Sitting listening to stories about domestic violence and about people fighting one another or being hideous to one another in one way or another, or having very low motives for what they did, you become a bit calloused or you become a bit depressed. And I think I was starting to become rather depressed. But when you're in the coroner's court, depression seems a long, long way away, where the meaning of your job is to try and give some people some answers about what had happened to people they loved. To lose someone in those circumstances, in the kind of cases that coroners deal with, is mind-bogglingly bewildering. It literally turns almost metaphorically turns your world upside down. So people can lose their faith if they have a faith, but if you can, with others, work in a team to provide some answers, possibly to give them the hope that at least we can learn something from this particular terrible event. It doesn't. I don't believe in closure, but it can give people a greater sense that the world is not entirely random and threatening to them and to people they love. So, and the other thing, so that gives you great meaning as a human being to be able to do that. And the second thing that I found very meaningful and uplifting, really, is to work with good people.
Professor Dillon says New South Wales' coronial system is outdated and should be reviewed every 30 to 35 years.
I actually think that the system itself is not very good in New South Wales. It's better than in some places, but the saving grace of our coronial system is the goodness, the big-heartedness, the empathy, the compassion of the people who work in it.
He says more resources would result in better understanding of the issues.
The general consensus developed over that time is that one of the most important things we should do, because we investigate all these deaths, is try to learn the lessons, or what lessons there are to be learned from all of these deaths, which may help us to prevent in future further deaths and serious injury to people. And people will give lip service to that. And in Coroners Acts all around the world, you'll find provisions saying, and let's prevent future deaths, and coroners can make recommendations to prevent future deaths. And governments will write that into legislation. But it actually has meaning in terms of the resources you provide, the structures you create, and the training and professional development you give to people to enable them to do these things. Now, coroners can't do all of those things. Coroners can't prevent future deaths and injury by themselves. It's a process that coroners go through with others who are often much more expert and much cleverer than the coroners themselves, because they know all about what it is, whatever this particular event is and how it might be possible to prevent it in future. So, but if you reconceptualize coroners as rather than being, solo Sherlock Holmeses all over the place trying to solve mystery deaths.
Here he explains the history.
So our coronial system really was created in the early 1900s, the late 1890s perhaps, and in essence it hasn't changed much since then. What we have, and what happened in the late 1890s and the early 1900s was governments came to realise that coroners, who could be the local, the local barrel maker or the local saddle maker or something in a country town, who just happened to be a worthy citizen, was on the local council. So the governor would make this person, always a man, the local coroner, and the local coroner would call together a jury of 5 or 6, and they would get together and they'd say, "Oh dear, what happened to Alice and Sandy? Let's investigate." And they would come up with their idea of whatever had happened. Well, around about that time, though, forensic medicine started to develop, but also the government came to realise we've got all over the state, we've got magistrates who are some of the most educated public servants in the country. They knew the law, or were assumed to know the law. In the rest of the world, they have coronial systems which stand all by themselves. So in England, which has had coroners since the 12th century, they wouldn't dream of giving a coroner a part-time job as a magistrate. They're so completely different, the two jobs. And yet we think that's a good idea, or we thought it was a good idea. Well, these sort of ideas have been challenged in Australia as well. So in about half the states in Australia, magistrates no longer do coronial work. And Victoria has the best coronial system in Australia, probably the best in the world.
Really?
New Zealand and Ontario are also very good coronial systems. They also have a large research team of around about, I think it's close to 30 people in a research unit, which is all about trying to work out, you're interested in domestic violence homicides. Well, they have a domestic violence homicide research team. So do we in New South Wales. And that's a good thing. All the states have these research teams in their coronial systems. But some, like Victoria and Ontario and New Zealand, have wider teams, death review teams. In New South Wales, we have other death review teams, child death review teams, but it's in the Ombudsman's office. So, which strikes me as just one of those ad hoc kind of things that governments do. Oh, we need a death review team. Where will we put it? Maybe in the Ombudsman's office. Why not have New South Wales Health's epidemiologists who are looking at mortality data and all of that sort of stuff directly linked into the coronial system? Why not integrate all of these sections of it?
So, do the domestic violence death review teams, did they end up amalgamating their research at all?
Do you mean all the state ones?
Yeah.
I don't know. To be honest, I know there's a network of all those teams, and there is also the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare, which takes an interest in mortality data generally. My personal experience was of murder-suicide cases mainly. I can remember doing a case, a man murdered his wife, ended up in jail, and then he committed suicide in jail. So I did an inquest into both those deaths. because they're both reportable deaths. But I can't remember how many, but I did a few murder-suicide cases, which were just terrible cases.
Were you okay? You know, does it take its toll on your mental health when you're dealing with terrible things like that?
Well, funnily enough, I don't think it did. Sometimes I wasn't having post-traumatic stress or anything. I don't think I was, but I would now find I did find it very difficult to look at photographs of people in death scenes. Strangely, I didn't find I could go down to the mortuary and look at what the forensic pathologists were doing without feeling terribly shocked by that. But I think that was a very clinical environment.
So just going back to is where this is an example potentially where the coronial system is in how this is an example of the coronial system doesn't work?
Number one, a flaw in all coronial systems is that coroners do concentrate on single cases. And that's because it's a kind of legal system. Lawyers do case by case by case. Epidemiologists do cluster cases together and look for patterns and trends. We have 8,000 cases, and in among those, you would find a lot of patterns and trends. But in New South Wales, we do not have people searching for those patterns and trends. So a coroner will be sitting at his or her desk and they'll notice just over time, due to their own personal experience, I keep seeing this over and over again.
Professor Dillon says a strategic plan needs to be established so coroners can concentrate their efforts.
Without a plan to look at what they're actually doing, to assess what they're actually doing, to set some objectives, to assess whether they're meeting the objectives, to collect the data around those objectives and to see whether they're meeting them, and to see whether are we being effective? Are we not being effective? How are we doing? Setting some relevant KPIs and performance data, you're just going to drift. And that's what we've seen for the last decades, I reckon. Well, certainly the last few years.
All right, last question. Why are these, what are the risks if New South Wales doesn't evolve or even the rest of the coronial jurisdictions don't evolve to maximise their capability? Why, I guess that's kind of like why the coronial system is so important.
It doesn't have a lot of resources. $20 million or so is not a lot of money to spend on a death investigation system that deals with 8,000 deaths a year and to be quite crude about it, the value of the government's put a monetary value on Australian lives, and it's nearly $6 million. The preventable deaths, there are around about 3,000 preventable deaths, or theoretically preventable deaths. I include suicides, domestic violence and so forth in that number. It is actually worth investing in a system that saves more lives.
Looking at the comments from our episodes in this series, there's a lot of anger directed at the decisions of judges, particularly regarding sentencing. So I thought it was important to talk to someone who specialises in educating people who work in our courts.
So I started off as a lawyer, a criminal lawyer in Victoria.
Heather Douglas is the author of the National Domestic and Family Violence Bench Book, a central resource for judicial officers to assist them with decision-making and judgment writing, which is updated regularly. She also wrote the book Women, Intimate Partner Violence and the Law.
So I've been working in family violence related stuff probably since the very beginning of my career in the 90s. I then moved to Alice Springs, working with Aboriginal people at the Aboriginal Legal Service as a defence lawyer. And it was pretty clear that Aboriginal women were really not getting any access to justice because all of the lawyers at the Aboriginal Legal Service were acting for the blokes, obviously. So we set up a domestic violence legal centre there, and that's still going, and that's become part of the Women's Legal Services Network. And then when I moved to Queensland in the early 2000s, late 1990s, I became an academic. And really since then, I've been more doing research around domestic and family violence. And as part of that, I have, obviously, for the last 10 years, I just finished up that task, but for the last 10 years, I've been managing the National Domestic and Family Violence Bench Book, which is meant to be a sort of training tool for judges working in the context of family violence and sort of aims to make judges respond to domestic and family violence more consistently across the various jurisdictions and across the various states and territories. So trying to develop an understanding of family violence that crosses over from family law to criminal law, child protection, and also crosses from, Northern Territory to Victoria to New South Wales, as far as it can, given different laws and legislation and so on. I've also taught domestic and family violence to undergraduate law students and postgraduate law students, and I've also been an expert witness in coronial inquests and criminal trials.
So how does that work? Obviously you've got the theory, but how does it work in practice when, you've got the bench book? In your mind, what sort of feedback have you got in explaining how it transitions into reality?
I work with the National Judicial Council, which basically rolls out legal education for judges, and they put on continuing professional development for judges every year. They do several sessions a year on specifically a day-long program on family violence, and judges in various jurisdictions sign up for that every year. So we go along and we talk to them about the bench book. We also talk to them about case examples to give them sort of a real sense of what coercive control looks like. And in a number of those training programs, cases like Hannah Clark's case has been used to exemplify those patterns and the fact that someone can be in really serious danger and yet not be experiencing physical violence necessarily. So we've really tried to push that home, that people can still be very much at risk without being hit or punched. We don't need to see that in order to see a pattern of behaviour that's potentially very dangerous. So that's really been the central message of all of that, to try to get that across.
Whenever you go through any appeal, they cite this and they cite that, and that ends up, as you say, setting a precedent. How do you overcome that? Is it a case that you need to basically bring in a new law to end that precedent? Just say that there's a negative aspect of it that ends in being what people would call lenient sentences?
The answer is yes. So for a good example of that is the strangulation laws that have been introduced around the country. So what we found was that a lot of strangulation cases don't leave a mark necessarily, but we know from all the research that if someone's strangled, they're at a much higher risk of being killed later in that relationship. And yet the strangulations that were being alleged in front of the courts were only being charged as assaults, potentially. And that goes on the criminal record as an assault, which could mean anything from, a slight push to something more serious. So it really doesn't give any indication to future police officers going to that scene as to what's been really happening in that context. So we thought strangulation was really important to override what was happening there in terms of how the law was really using assault as a response to strangulation rather than more serious charges. And I think that's been really effective, both in bringing strangulation to the attention of people across Australia as a really serious issue, and also increasing penalties to ensure accountability for people who carry out that kind of offence, and also for making sure police are aware of criminal records where a person's got a criminal record for strangulation. That should put them on notice that this person is potentially very dangerous and the victim is potentially at high risk.
Professor Douglas is referring to non-fatal strangulation laws, which have been rolled out in every state in the past decade.
Yeah, so I was very involved very early on in this, and certainly campaigned for strangulation to be introduced in Queensland as a response specifically to domestic and family violence. And it's now in place in every state and territory jurisdiction in Australia. Melbourne, where I'm living now, actually has been the last state to roll it out.
Well, they still don't have coercive control laws.
You know, the coercive control offences, we've got, it's been a really short period of time that there's actually offences that have been in play, and they're not charged an extraordinary number of times, and they do seem to have the same profile, and we certainly can't, there's not statistics really available in Australia. I think there's been 300 cases or something in New South Wales at this point, so it's very low. And in terms of completions, in terms of, you know, successful prosecutions, we have very few to look at this stage to see what the profile of people who are charged is. And I think our context in Australia is fairly specific.
Yeah, and that's one of the reasons that we're looking at these case studies in retrospect, you know, looking at it in the context of coercive control. For something like Bait and Clare, which was heavily publicised, it's easy to see the coercive control there.
It only came out, though, because of the family becoming willing to share and feeling the support of the community, and that was a bit similar with Hannah Clark. I think that her family weren't initially necessarily seeing him as abusive. They could see all of the issues they had with him, that he was isolating, that he was saying things about her in public and so on, that they shared social media and all of those kinds of things, which were all red flags. And it's only in retrospect, when all of those things are added together after sort of the inquest, that we can kind of name it. A lot of women I've interviewed about coercive control, they look back on how their relationship started and they can see red flags given what they know now. And I think educating women as much as educating men about what's wrong, what kind of behaviour is wrong, you know, ensuring that women who are in relationships, early on in relationships, before they have kids, that they're calling out isolation, that they're calling out, you know, the kinds of overuse of text messages and effectively stalking and surveillance that goes on in relationships. If they're understanding that as part of this pattern of control early in the relationship, before they get enmeshed with children and finances and house buying and all of the kinds of things that couples do, I think that's really fantastic.
Professor Douglas acknowledges how important law reform is in driving cultural change, but emphasises it must be managed and properly resourced.
I think the criminal law is one of our main tools to sort of name and denounce behaviour as a society, and we do rely on it to do that. So I can certainly see that argument for criminal law, for sure. I guess my concern with criminalisation in general is that we don't have a very good toolkit for responding to crime. We really rely heavily on putting people in jail. But when he comes out, he's very damaged, more damaged than he was when he went in, probably by the experience of prison, and he'll be much more dangerous to other women when we get out and when he gets out. And we see that happening over and over again. So that is my concern primarily, is that we rely too heavily on prison in the way that prison operates at the moment, and it's very unsuccessful at rehabilitating. I think the only thing that we can say is good about prison is the reprieve that women will get for the short time that that person is in prison. And our interviews with prisoners in Queensland, for example, just suggest that it's an incredibly misogynistic and toxic environment, which just increases misogyny essentially in the prison environment, and those men come out with a real vendetta against women, which is obviously not ideal.
Well, yeah, particularly when there's so many of them in there in that respect.
So I think we need to do better in figuring out how best to respond, and I just don't have brilliant ideas about that. But there are some who talk about certain forms of men's behaviour change. A lot of the men that go into prison actually never get access to any of those kinds of programs, so we don't even know if they'll work for them. Because of the pressure on prisons and so on, and the prisons on delivering those programs.
We'll return to Professor Douglas in a minute, but let's look at an alternative for those who can be rehabilitated. I spoke to No to Violence CEO, Philip Ripper.
Men contact our men's referral service 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. They can talk to a trained counsellor who's always available and on call. They can talk about what brings them to seek help, and we can work with that man to get them on a pathway of change. We do also get people who are referred to the men's referral service because they've come in contact with police and the courts, And we often, in Victoria and Tasmania, we follow up those men who have been contacted by police around their family violence. So we have a mix of people coming in contact with note of violence, but our members are often running 20-week men's behaviour change programs, so working directly with men in a group to really unpack their use of violence and to challenge their assumptions, their understanding of relationships and their understanding of violence and its role and their choices that they're making. So that's the work that our members do, and we at Note of Violence, we support the public to know more about men's use of family violence. We undertake research, we undertake advocacy, and we provide training to the sector, and we make sure that that men who are concerned about their behaviour can get the support they need to choose differently.
How many do you have at any one time?
Tens of thousands of men every year come through our service, and that is still only a drop in the ocean. We know that in New South Wales alone, around 10% of the male population aged 18 to 34 have had contact with police around family violence. So the figures and the prevalence of family violence in this country are overwhelming, and we need to do so much more to stop it at the source, turn off the tap, and get men to end their use of family violence. Because without intervention, men will just keep going so often and just repeat cycle after cycle of family violence with partner after partner. So if we're going to end it, we really have to focus on men and do what it takes to get them to choose different.
So how effective is then these sorts of intervention?
Well, men's behaviour change programs, we need to invest a lot more to really understand, but we know that they can change men's lives. In New South Wales, there's only 900 spots a year in men's behaviour change programs, and we're talking hundreds of thousands of men who could benefit. So we really just need to do so much better and learn so much more about what works for what men at what time.
So how does it work?
We have a really innovative program that's working incredibly well in Victoria. What that has done is it takes men who have used violence, who are now excluded from the family home, and instead of the women and children fleeing to emergency accommodation, it's actually the person using violence who is moved to emergency accommodation. And so one of the things we'll do is we'll fund emergency accommodation, support that man in a hotel or a motel room while he gets his act together. It's just not okay, the current system, and that's why we need to really flip the script and stop family violence at the source.
Well, you know what would be really good if they can get their act together with other, because it's all about agencies sort of sharing, not working in silos, is those ones determining the psychology of which ones can actually be rehabilitated as opposed to the ones that can't.
That's exactly right. We need that investment from governments into the research and the evaluation, and we need innovative models. What we have at the moment right across Australia is behaviour change programs that were designed for men who wanted to be there, men who wanted to change and were looking for help. What we're now seeing is those programs getting flooded with men who have been referred from the courts. They're men who are required to be there, and it's quite a different cohort of men. We know behaviour change in any other field of human behaviour is not simple, and it's not a straight line. And no one's got a magic wand. That's why we really need to be far more sophisticated. I think I might have said last time that I heard a figure the other day that only 0.2 of 1% of all family violence research is actually into the perpetration of family violence.
This is from the American Psychological Association's 2023 Scoping Review. Back to Professor Douglas.
I'm not the only one who saw this, but when I was doing a research project about 3 years in to when I started the bench book, and that was interviewing women about their experiences with the legal system after leaving family violence. And something that they all pointed out to me was that the legal system itself was part of the problem in terms of extending and facilitating the abuse. So they were talking about something that I've called legal systems abuse. And we introduced that onto the bench book, and I think that most judges we speak to would be pretty aware that the legal system can be used by abusers to facilitate their abuse. And so they do that by multiple applications in different courts for spurious things that they don't care whether they win or lose, but they just want to get those women into court, trying to adjourn. So I think that most judges we talk to say that, you know, adjournments sound like they're neutral, but really think about whether the adjournment is just to get the woman back to court. She has to get a day off work, she has to get childcare, she has to see her abuser again. It's very traumatic. It's a way of controlling her.
Is there any, I guess, bucket list or wish list or something that you would say?
You're asking me for something positive, aren't you? What I want to do is look at all of the coronial inquests where there's been a non-finding, because as much as there are all of these increased numbers of domestic homicides, unfortunately, I don't know that is the true number. The hidden homicide problem is very real, as you've pointed out in your previous work. So, you know, that would be really interesting to look at all those unfounded cases in Australia, I think, to see what's going on and whether they've been properly investigated. I suspect we would be disturbed by that. It's this fine line, though, between, you know, respecting the need to include men in the conversation, but at the same time ensuring that the people are accountable for their violence, and that women are safe. So, you know, I guess it's a journey to try to get it right, and it's taken too long.
Next week, recognising the risk.
Because they present well in prison, and because when they're being risk assessed, those risk assessors are not trained in coercive control and stalking.
And will families of victims finally get a say in the plea bargaining process?
It's an obligation under the Charter for the OPP to consult with families and to take them through that process.
If you would like to share any information on the cases we've mentioned or discuss a different intimate partner homicide, please contact us. Just email us at kissandkill@7.com.au or visit our website 7news.com.au/kissandkill. Check out our show notes for information about everyone you've heard in today's episode, but also links to various domestic and family violence charities which are making enormous headway in this space. If you're on Facebook or Instagram, you can follow us to see photos and updates relevant to the series. And if you like what you're hearing, don't forget to subscribe. Please rate and review our series. It helps new listeners find us. Presenter and executive producer, Alison Sandy. Sound design, Mark Wright. Assistant producer and video editor, Cassie Woodward. Graphics, Jason Blanford. Video editor, Carmen Bensley. Special thanks to Dr. Clare Ferguson and Sherele Moody. This is a 7 News production.